Good morning. I'm Pat Matthews, Associate Dean in University College. Welcome to the first talk in our MLA lecture series. The Master of Liberal Arts, or MLA, fosters intellectual breadth through courses that address a range of issues from different academic perspectives. It's in the same spirit that the MLA lecture series addresses a theme from multiple disciplines in the hopes that hearing from diverse points of view provides insights and promotes discussion beyond the sum of the talks. Our theme this year is unprecedented times. Last year's MLA series final talk may have been the last large indoor public gathering that many of us attended. Whether it's the isolation and devastation of COVID, the recent attack on the nation's capital, or the renewed Black Lives Matter movement, this year has been unprecedented. It's difficult not to understand the world through one or more of these lenses. Rather than asking our speakers to address a theme, I've invited these faculty members to tell us about their work. But I believe that how we understand their work and our response to it will be framed by the unprecedented times in which we are living. A bit of logistics before we get started. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. If you press that, you'll be able to submit written questions at any time. Our speaker has agreed to field these questions both during the talk and at the end. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Arny Nadler is Associate Professor in the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts and chaired the undergraduate program there from 2013 to 18. He's the recipient of a number of grants and awards, including the George Sugarman Foundation Grant, a Regional Arts Commission Fellowship, a Regional Arts Commission Artist Support Grant, and 2 Sam Fox School Faculty Creative Research Grants. Nadler has works in the permanent collection of the Down Museum of Contemporary Art and has exhibited work around the country, including the Orange County Center for Contemporary Art, the Clay Center of New Orleans, the Evanston Art Center, and the Turchin Art Center, with reviews in Art in America and other publications. His most recent solo exhibition, entitled Firstlings, Sculptures and Works on Paper, is the topic of his talk today. In a recent interview, Brainerd Carey notes that Nadler's latest series investigates the body in a state of ambiguous metamorphosis. Having lived almost exclusively in my home for the last year, the state of ambiguous metamorphosis explored in Nadler's work strikes a chord with me, almost as if I am discovering growth and mutation on aspects of myself that should be completely familiar. I look forward to hearing Arny's take on the work as well as yours. From your home, please send welcoming thoughts to our speaker, Arny Nadler.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for helping me prepare for this, and thank you, John Hinderleiter, for your assistance in getting me all ready for the talk. And it's an honor for me to take some time and talk to you a little bit about my most recent exhibition. Special thanks to Dean Heather Corcoran, who suggested me for the series. So and thank you to Bruno David, whose gallery I had this exhibition with recently. And so I'm looking forward to chat with you about the work. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. So the pieces I'm going to talk to you about today are from a series I've titled Firstlings. I thought it would help to first lay out some nuts and bolts information about the work. And some of the images, I'll have something to say about most of the images that I'm going to be showing you, but for a couple of them, I'm just going to show the image and not say anything, just so you can kind of take a look at it. So the sculptures I'm showing today were made between 2017 and 2020. They're all painted ceramic. I've been working with clay since 2012. And while I was trained as a sculptor, I had very little formal education in ceramics. Most of my previous work was actually made out of welded steel, conceptually similar, but out of manifest in a very different kind of materiality. I made both gallery work as well as some large scale outdoor pieces. Okay, so here's some basic information about what you're going to see today. The pieces in the series range in height from about 25 to 45 inches and are painted with several layers of varying colors to build up some visual depth. At the gallery, we selected 12 pieces and divided them between two adjacent rooms, with the white pieces in one space, making the experience very light and airy, and the darker pieces in the other space, creating a very different sense of weight and gravity. The decision to do that didn't really happen until the work was brought to the gallery. I really enjoy working with a gallerist and the collaborative nature of doing an installation like this. It's great to have someone else's perspective on how a show can be set up and how to strategize about placement with someone who sees the work with fresh eyes. I find that to be really incredibly helpful. The drawings in the exhibition are made with India ink and water, kind of similar to the process of watercolor painting. I call them studies because they are just that. They began as a kind of warm-up exercise to get my hand and my eyes in sync with each other before working on the clay pieces. These drawings are 11 by 15 inches, and when I first started making them a couple of years ago, I never gave much thought to the idea of showing them in public. I really just thought of them as a way to get thoughts down on paper, a way to focus my attention, kind of like a cross between a breathing exercise and jotting down a note or a sketch. So the drawings are quick, experimental, and very low risk for me. I'll talk about how the tandem processes of drawing and sculpting work for me in a bit. A lot of people ask me about the colors I choose to work with. By using a mostly monochromatic strategy when it comes to the sculptures, I'm directing the conversation about the work toward form rather than surface. Most, but not all, of the pieces have a matte finish. I want them to appear as though they are the same color and substance throughout. Imagine snapping a piece of charcoal or chalk in half. I want the sculptures to have the same kind of quality as that. Some of the pieces I'll show you today were not in the show, but are part of the series that I'm discussing. The pieces are not only monochromatic, they're neutral in color. So if this piece were bright pink, we might start to talk about cliche gender associations or chewing gum or marketing and commodification of toys or stuff like that. And while I accept that everyone brings their own history and perspective to an art piece, I'm trying to assert control where I can, pointing the viewer in a particular direction and away from other directions. For titling, each piece in the series is assigned a chronological number. For instance, this piece is Firstling number 2, and there are nearly 30 in the series to date. The title of Firstlings comes from the notion that these proto-forms, perhaps primordial, early in their formation, and in a state of ambiguous metamorphosis. A few of the earlier pieces are what I call biomorphic, more so than figurative. So here's another early example of what I would call more of a biomorphic form. This actually is Firstling number 1. Okay, a bit more about the series title. Firstlings relates to what the pieces are about, but also how this work and the process of making the work functions in my mind. The thesis of the body of work is my starting point, the idea of these proto-figures and forms, but the true nature of each piece, how it looks and exists in space, unfolds as I am making it in real time. The process is very much of the moment, so much so that I'm surprised by my work nearly every time I look at it. They always remain slightly unfamiliar to me because I don't really plan out my moves far ahead of time, which is a state of mind that I find as a maker very exciting. A bit now about my interest in the figure. At the root of it all, as an artist and as a human being, I am obsessed with the predicament of the human form, both its fragility and its dominance in the environment. Some back history. I'm the son of an immigrant tool and die maker who was permanently paralyzed in a factory accident. I was very young when this happened, and while my work isn't specifically about that event, I grew up preoccupied with the notion of wholeness, of body and place. I think this predisposed me to a kind of hyper awareness that our bodies, our environments, our occupations, and our preoccupations might betray us. I think making sculpture has always been my way of understanding the world and how we fit in it, and how we negotiate the particular nature of our individual, yet not completely unique circumstances. The sculptures tend to nod at a structural order, but they disregard any kind of anatomical or proportional correctness.
Hey, Arny?
Yes.
Is this a good time just to break for a quick question?
Sure.
So you just talked about, being in the moment and often being surprised by where you landed. And one of our listeners, Terry Weiss, asks, when you made your first piece in a series, how did you know it was finished?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I know when I'm finished, or with that piece, or actually I think with any piece, I think I know when I'm done if what I'm doing with it, if I start to become like too finicky with it, if I'm not really making any moves on it that are really advancing the piece, and some of that is really formal, if the texture is where I need it to be. And so if I find myself just kind of like fussing with it, I usually just tell myself, let it go, put it down and stop working on it. And I think that and I'll talk in a bit about how I paint the sculptures too, but I think that that's true for the painting as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And just one quick follow-up on that.
Sure.
Working in clay, once you're done, are you done? Or, I mean, do you have that chance to go back later and do something more if you decide maybe you weren't done?
Well, so the way it works is you can kind of add onto a clay object while it still maintains some degree of moisture. Once it gets too dry, just kind of air dry, then trying to stick something to it, it just won't stick. It just won't stay on. Once I've fired something, and I'll talk about that a little bit too, I can go in and then it becomes kind of closer to stone. And if I want, I can go in and kind of engrave it or use other tools to do that. But once I've stopped working on it and it dries to a certain degree, I'm done. I can't really do much to it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Great. Thank you for those. So I tend to draw on human, animal, and unworldly kinds of bodies. And I do this freely and without a lot of concern or predetermination. I like the equalizing effect that this has. In the work, it's not humans at the top or other mammals below, and then insects or amoebas or whatever somewhere down really low. I imagine that even they don't know what they truly are. Some are, in fact, grotesque or alluring or both. On many of the pieces, you can see a thin layer of what looks like a wrapping of bandages or a mummification or a scarification. This points to a wound or a transition or a transformation, something in an altered state of itself, on its way to or from wholeness. So I'll talk a little bit now about ceramic as a material. I work in clay strategically for its mutability and its plasticity. For me, it's an exciting, ancient material with an incredibly rich history of figurative work. I love what it can do, and at the same time, I struggle with its limitations. And I've had lots of failures. Sometimes pieces fall apart, but oftentimes a failure is an opportunity to try something daring or unexpected, something you wouldn't normally set out to do. The what have I got to lose factor comes into play, and I'll make a move with a piece that is completely foreign to me. I think you enter a new kind of mental territory when this happens, and you see things that you might not normally notice. I want to create a new visual experience for me and hopefully for the viewer. I don't start working on a piece with a finished form in mind. Rather, I think about how I want the form to behave in space, how I might want to draw the viewer around it, what I want it to do. I'm constantly thinking in terms of verbs, not nouns. Twisting, wrapping, contorting, emerging, collapsing. That's how I try to make a static form active. I'm constantly making decisions while I'm working. Some of them are based on general composition. Do I like what's happening here? Is it exciting? Is it alluring? Is it weird? I tend to think that weird is good. So many of the pieces have these irregular outgrowths that signal some kind of erratic germination or atrophy, what I call a misfiguration of appendages. Limbs that don't appear to work oftentimes take on pronounced roles in the visual hierarchy that I'm assembling. And so we might wonder if these figures are broken or just suited better for an environment that we don't understand. The resulting forms are often simultaneously heroic and absurd. They tend to acknowledge the limitations of the body and flout conventional response systems. In great contrast, the drawings are quick and gestural and allow me to experiment without, excuse me, worrying about material failure or gravity.
Arny, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Do you want to break again for a couple
Sure.
questions? Okay. First, just a few from Kent Hirschfelter that are maybe quicker to answer. Are any of these pieces currently on display in St. Louis, and where does your clay come from?
Okay, so this show just came down in January. It was up from October 31st to mid-January. No, it's not currently on display right now. And then the clay I purchased from Kruger Pottery, which is here in St. Louis. They're in the Brentwood area. And I'll talk in a bit about the clay, but a lot of people like make their own clay. They get all the dry ingredients, and there are kind of proprietary, recipes about them. And so I use like a sculpture body, which is like a kind of clay that's really kind of engineered for making larger scale work. Yeah.
And then part of the reason I paused here is because you've just gone back and forth between your ceramics and your ink work. And Leslie Markle asks, there's an extremely interesting dynamic between the ink sketches and the ceramic sculptures. However, you talked about not really intending to exhibit the former. Could you talk about the ethos behind working in a single medium for the work/series rather than a multimedia approach?
Okay, so I think that for me, there's something about focusing pretty exclusively on what a material can do and kind of what the clay can do. And so, yes, these are singular objects made out of clay that are on a pedestal. I think it's because I really want to focus the attention on really what's happening within the form and what the form is doing. And I think when I look back, no matter what the material is, I've tended to kind of work in that manner, even with some like larger scale outdoor pieces as well. So I also think that for me, there's something exciting about limitations and parameters, and just kind of telling myself I'm going to make this happen with this singular material. To me, gives me something. There's something about the material that I then kind of push up against creatively and formally that I find to be exciting, and I think that happens, in the sculptures and in the drawings as well. I don't go back in and use charcoal pencil or anything like that. It's just that material. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I think we'll move on. We have more questions coming, but that was a nice break.
Okay. So again, I don't spend more than about 15 minutes on any one drawing. And once I'm done, I'm done. I never go back to rework them or anything. I don't want to. I don't want them to become precious, and I never want to get too fussy with them. Their spontaneity is really crucial to me. But like the sculptures, I'm paying close attention to what the material does. These are about fluidity and staining. I never know what the end product will look like when I start. I make a mark, I respond to it, I respond to that, and so on. A lot of sculptors draw. I think it's because for many of us, the process of making three-dimensional things can be slow or almost burdensome at times. And for a while, I was looking for a way to approach it in a way that was similar to the process of making sculptures. I don't want to make drawings of my sculptures. I want to build an image in the same way that I build a sculpture. I'll look for an event or a transition or the suggestion of a kind of form, and then I'll see if I can incorporate that into a sculpture. Working in clay allows for the recording of the most minute touch or influence on the material. but it also constantly poses a problem. It takes constant monitoring and building strategies to keep it upright. I've come to the studio several mornings to find a work in progress collapsed on the floor because I worked too fast or too heavy or too risky. I can put those concerns aside when I draw. It's important to note that there is never an exact one-to-one relationship between a drawing and a sculpture, between my drawings and sculptures. The two practices are symbiotic and they influence each other, but one is not a blueprint for the other. Making art for me is just a mode of thinking, and working in an iterative manner, trying to keep my production level relatively high, keeps me in an exploratory state of mind. I don't think of myself as a cynic or a pessimist, but I do think that life, for all of us, for all living things, is a struggle. And this predicament of the human form and the human condition that I mentioned at the start of the talk refers to our uneasy, often unsympathetic, and hostile existence that is not necessarily predisposed to human wants or needs. So I thought I would show you some shots from my studio of the work in progress. So as I mentioned before, I use a kind of clay that's well suited to making large sculpture. Clay shrinks as it dries. And these pieces are fired to nearly 2000 degrees in a kiln. So I use a kind of clay engineered to do what I want it to do. You can see here that I've wrapped the edges, kind of the top edge of this piece in progress with wet paper towels here to keep it pliable enough for me to continue to work on it. Building onto clay that's too dry is very problematic. So these pieces are sprayed down with water and wrapped every night until I'm done working on them. Once I'm done sculpting the piece, I'll lightly wrap it up in plastic, loosening up the wrapping in stages over the course of a week, because it's better if the piece dries slowly and uniformly. I'll then remove the wrapping completely and let it air dry for a few weeks. In the kiln, any residual moisture will turn to steam at the boiling point and will essentially explode the piece in the kiln. So after air drying for a few weeks, the piece will sit in the kiln set at about 180 degrees for about 12 hours to drive off any and all moisture, making it completely bone dry. Then the temperature is slowly ramped up to your desired temperature. The whole process, including cool down, takes about 24 hours, and it can be completely terrifying. So here's a painted and completed sculpture. This is a more recent piece that was completed for the Bruno David exhibition. Here, as well as in some of the next few pieces I'll show, I think you can start to see more and more of the influence of drawing on the sculptures. So I've got some more in progress shots where you can see that I'm using foam and sponges to support the clay while it dries so it has enough rigidity to continue working on it. There's this constant monitoring going on, letting certain parts dry enough to support further building while keeping other areas wet enough to add more clay. I have lots of foam in my studio. Sometimes it can get pretty kooky, pretty crazy. And so here's a shot of the piece now where sculpting is completed, but just kind of air drawing and kind of awaiting the kiln. Another great thing about clay is that you can work with it in both an additive and subtractive manner. It's not uncommon for me to cut off part of the work and add it back on in another location, or even cut a part off and start building a new piece from what I've removed. Speaking of cutting things apart, some of my pieces, these two, for example, are just too big to fit in the kiln. And when I'm working on a sculpture, I mean, I can work with the dimension of the kiln in mind, but I kind of don't want that to be a limiting factor because I want to reduce certain kinds of limiting factors. So I will, when the piece is completed, I'll cut it into parts, let them dry, and then fire them. And then I'll epoxy the parts back together and fill the seams with a sculpting putty. So what you see over here in that kind of darker kind of wet part is dried epoxy, which is incredibly strong. And then over here, and here are a few of the pieces that have been kind of put back together again, sculpted with putty so that those seams become seamless. So again, I use a pretty monochromatic coloration strategy. The paint is built up in several layers, usually 5 or 6. I start dark and add lighter variations in thinner layers. So there are slight variations and undertones, but it reads as a singular kind of form or substance. I tend to work on 5 or 6 pieces to completion, and then I'll paint them all at the same time. And when I'm working in the studio, I do tend to work on 2 pieces at the same time, which allows for, on a technical level, I can work on something and kind of let it stiffen up and dry a bit while I work on something else. It also just kind of keeps me on my toes a little bit, so I don't just get too lost in one piece, and it keeps the process, I think, fresh for me. And all along, there's a constant back and forth with the drawing and the sculpting. almost on a daily kind of basis. I think some of the influences they have on each other are overt, others much more subconscious. And it's clear to me that the layering and flowing of the ink drawings has me thinking a lot about how the clay forms can emerge in space, similar to how the ink flows on paper and how form can emerge in that manner as well. And so this is Firstling number 29, and it's the newest member of the series. And I thought I'd show you a few views of the piece, since I really do consider them as objects in the round. And I thought I would conclude with just a few more installation shots of the exhibition. And a plug for Bruno David Gallery. If you aren't familiar with the gallery, I urge you to join the mailing list. He's located in Clayton. He puts on some, I think, some great shows. And he represents several members of the Sam Fox School community, including some professors and some alumni. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Arny. I wish, one of the problems with the webinar is you can't hear the audience applauding. Let me say for everyone, this was a truly wonderful experience to see your work. It's a really nice, pause, I think, in some ways, and to hear you talk about it. We do have a number of questions.
Sure.
First from Terry Weiss, as pieces go through their adolescence, do you do any pruning as the human brain does?
Could you repeat that for me, please? I'm sorry.
Sure, and I got some background noise here. I'm sorry. I'll text that to shut up in a minute. But
okay.
As pieces go through their adolescence, do you do any pruning as the human brain does?
Pruning. Is that what you said? Pruning? That's an interesting question. I mean, do you mean like actually as I'm assuming you mean like as I'm actually making them and kind of building up the forms, they, again, what's great about I think my answer would be yes. So what's great about the forms is while that clay is in its somewhat wet stage, it's not uncommon for me to, I'll be working on it and like cut this part off and maybe get rid of it, or cut it off and stick it somewhere else. And sometimes that happens based on purely formal decisions, you know, like how's it looking in space and how is it directing my, you know, directing the eye around it. But sometimes it'll also happen because I want to draw attention to someplace, or because maybe the kind of anatomy of the structure of the piece is looking too normal, and I'll want to create kind of a more mysterious effect with it. So I hope that answers that question. Pat, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll let Terry follow up if she wants to hear more on that. So we also have a question, a technical question. What support are you using for the ink drawings? For example, paper type, Yupo, etc. The translucency is distinctive.
Okay, so thank you. The paper is it's a pretty inexpensive paper. I think it's called, the brand is Canson, I'm pretty sure. It's not an expensive paper. It comes in different size tablets, and these are like 11 by 15 tablets. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing kind of extraordinary about that paper. Yeah. Yeah, I get it.
It's you. It is
no.
Amazing. Yeah.
Well, I get it at Blick. I think that the translucency comes from, so what I'll do is I'll have like again, similar to watercolor, you've got like this kind of plastic dish with several, imagine like an ink carton kind of plastic form with several wells in it. And so I'll put a few drops of ink into one, and then I will just kind of like, I'll have several, like maybe 3 or 4 different dilutions of it. And I'll start to kind of use those to, and sometimes I'll even just kind of add water with the brush, which tends to kind of really, like the paper just kind of like pulls it or grabs it and stuff like that. Sometimes I'll pick up the paper and kind of drive the bus a little bit with it to kind of get it to move the way I want it to move. Yeah. Some
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I am struggling to get my husband to lay off the saw. This is from Amy Hoff, and she says, and I'm going to mispronounce something along the way. When I look at your clay works, one of the things I think about is the history of ceramics, specifically the Commedia dell'arte Meissen figurines. I wonder if this is something you are specifically drawing from, or rather you are interested in working in this specialty arena to make room for these kinds of associations when your viewers take them in.
Thank you, Amy. That's a good question. I am not specifically, I do tend to look at a lot of figurative work from kind of a broader, as well as like a lot of contemporary artists who are working with the figure. I think that I'm hoping that my work kind of opens up a larger dialogue about these, the kind of heroic history that we oftentimes see in figurative work. Some contemporary artists that I look at are Johan Tejon, who's a Belgian artist. Rebecca Warren is someone I look at a lot as well. And then kind of going back in time, Elizabeth Frink, I think, I look at a lot. As well as, you know, like Rodin too, of course. So, yeah.
Okay, we also just have a comment. Thank you for including the studio pictures. Enjoy seeing your process. And then a question from Wynn Miller. One's life is subject to inevitable change. Is there room in your ongoing process to express recast perspectives, or will you forever be wedded to firstlings?
I don't think I'm forever wedded to anything. I think that I'm excited to see where the work is going to go. And for me, having just finished an exhibition, what I'm pleased about is I'm really excited to get back in the studio and to continue working and to see how the work is going to evolve. So I imagine that I probably will not forever be working on Firstlings. But I feel like I have more to explore with it, and I feel like I've got some momentum with it.
Yeah. Okay, from Ty Van Thomas. When do you find your most creative times, and what inspires you?
My most creative times? Well, I tend to work in the studio like it's a job. So, I'm kind of a morning guy. And so like over the summer when I'm not teaching, I will and I can have a studio day, I'll go for a run really early and I'll breakfast and I'll try to spend all day at the studio, and I pack my lunch in my lunch pail and it's like a job for me. And so I tend to work that way because it's something that requires constant attention as opposed to kind of becoming inspired and then running off to the studio to work.
Right.
So I feel like the more I do it, the more I kind of approach it as much as possible as like a daily, or, that doesn't always happen, of course, activity. That's when the work happens. And I think that some of the inspiration comes from, again, some of the history that I have. I think some of it comes from just a real fascination with form and structures. And I think that artists, oftentimes they do things because they have to see it. They really want to see it, in front of them. And they really want to kind of develop this relationship of just kind of a building and making. And so that's where my inspiration comes from.
Thank you. Another question from Terry Weiss. Given your view of the human condition, do you consider yourself an existentialist?
I don't know.
Okay. Fair enough, I think. All right, and here's an easier one from Kent Hirschfelder. He wants to know the weight of your larger pieces.
I think the larger ones, so the earlier larger pieces are heavier because I had less experience making them and it probably made them too thick. But some of those guys are good, like I think 50 pounds, maybe a little bit less. Yeah, so I think they range in kind of weight from like about 30, 35 pounds to maybe up to 50 pounds, I think, yeah.
Thank you. Another technical question. What kind of paint do you use? You mentioned colors earlier, but this person also wants to know what colors you're using.
Okay, so for the most recent work, they're latex paints, and so I will I'll start with like a really heavy duty kind of primer coat to kind of because the clay is really porous, and so I want to seal it up, and then I'll build up layers and layers of latex paint. Yeah, and the colors are some of them I tend to kind of get a few and then mix my own, and then maybe I'll take them to the hardware store and kind of get more made. Yeah.
A question from Peter Taylor. Peter asks, I once worked as a ceramic artist apprentice where I would spend hours stacking bricks in the kiln prior to firing. I would imagine modern day kilns are a bit more efficient, but maybe not. And what is the heat source? So something about the kiln you're firing in.
Okay, so I fire my pieces in an electric kiln, not a gas kiln. So they are pretty efficient, and they some of them do have some kind of computer programming, so you can really dial in like this is how long I want it to be at this temperature, and then I can start to ramp it up at a very, very slow rate. But yeah, I don't use gas kilns. I think that comes into more that can come into become much more useful if you are playing with a variety of glazes that are in kind of oxidation and things like that, where you really kind of get into what the heat and the flame and the mix, where the kind of combustible environment can do to glazes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess you're concerned about your work enough ending up whole after the firing that probably an electric kiln's the way to go there.
And I've had pieces blow up in electric kiln too. It happens. There's no mercy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question from Marty Einig. Does music inspire your work? And if yes, how?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to listen to way too much NPR in the studio. I listen to a lot, but there are, I think it's interesting, like, or funny or weird or whatever, when I tend to get kind of closer to finishing a piece, I'll listen to a lot of instrumental music. I like listening to jazz or even some classical music. So it certainly does keep me company in the studio.
Okay, one last question. You started off talking about working with the gallerist and how much you appreciate that collaboration and what they bring to the work. But you've also talked about at a certain point being done with the piece. You fiddle with it and that's it. Once you're done, but you're, say, working on an exhibition, does the work change for you? Do you start finding different things in it, given these new perspectives and maybe the way that they're in the exhibit?
I think that I think context is really important, and so sure, when the pieces start to come together in an exhibition, I'll start to see kind of relationships between them. I think how we negotiate a space becomes really important, and that's certainly something that you think about when you set up a show. So and I actually have enjoyed kind of going back to the gallery and just spending time with the work, which is something that you don't really see in the same way when it's in your studio. So does the work change? I don't know if I would say that the work changes, but I think that you see it in a new light. You see new nuances between it, and I think of like the things that happen in a sculpture as being like an event or a moment. And it's great to have new and kind of fresh perspective on those events that happen in the piece or in the pieces. Especially also, one more thing, and I think it's hard in the studio because of the nature of the studio to really get as much from that relationship between the sculptures and the drawings. Mm-hmm. And so having them in that kind of space where you can really start to see them play off of each other is really exciting.
Okay, and Arny, I said that was the last question, but there was one in the chat that I missed that I would like to go back and ask you. And this is from Norman Solomon. Mm-hmm. And he would like to know where your ideas originate, and then also how large is your studio?
Well, my studio altogether is about 2,000 square feet, and it's in University City, really close to my house, which is really great. And I think that my ideas kind of originate from, I think, a combination of personal history, of responding to what I've seen in both historically and sculpture specifically, and also contemporary practice. And I also think that again, I really think that making is a form of thinking. And so these pieces really become a way of me thinking through ideas, thinking through form, and seeing how they develop. So I don't think there's really one kind of point of origin of the ideas. I think it comes from a multitude of influences.
Okay, Arny, at this point, I just want to extend a huge thank you to you. I know the audience also wants to express their thanks. If you'd like to put something in the chat or the Q&A, we'll make sure that Arny sees your appreciation. So again, thank you very much, Arny. And then also I would like to thank you, our participants, for being with us this morning, for your thoughtful questions. I hope you will join us again next week when our speaker is Jeff Ward, Professor of African and African American Studies, who will speak on monumental anti-racism. So again, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.